The auctioneer's voice cracked on the final call. Sold to the gentleman in the back row for $14,000. That gentleman was 85 years old. He paid cash. And that farm he just bought was the 9th one he'd ever purchased. Every single one of those farms had once belonged to someone who told him he was finished. But to understand how he got here, you have to go back 36 years, to a spring morning in 1967, to a John Deere dealership in Platte City, Missouri, and to 6 words that changed everything. You're too old for this, Earl. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to say something. This channel exists for one reason: to tell the stories that everybody else has forgotten. The farmers nobody wrote about. The land deals nobody covered. The quiet men and women who outlasted everyone who doubted them. If that's the kind of story you've been looking for, hit subscribe right now, because this one, Earl Hawkins and the Rule That Saved 30 Farms, is exactly why this channel exists. Stay with me. You're going to want to hear every single word of this. Earl Hawkins walked into Granger's John Deere dealership on a Tuesday morning in March of 1967. He was 49 years old, and he wasn't there for a tractor. He wasn't there for a plow, a planter, or a combine. He was there for a hydraulic fitting, a $4 part for his 1953 Farmall Super M, a tractor he'd bought used 9 years earlier for $1,400. Earl was not a complicated man. He wore the same thing every day: khaki work pants, a gray cotton shirt, brown boots he resoled every 2 years instead of replacing. He had hands like leather gloves and a face that looked like it had been carved out of walnut by someone who didn't believe in smooth edges. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. Donnie Granger, on the other hand, talked plenty. Donnie was 36 years old, third-generation John Deere dealer, grandson of the man who'd sold equipment in Platte County since 1928. He wore pressed green shirts with the John Deere logo, polished boots, and a college ring from Mizzou. He had a sales quota. He had a mortgage on a dealership expansion he'd just finished. And when he saw Earl Hawkins come through that door, he saw an opportunity. He leaned against the parts counter, and he smiled the way salesmen smile when they think they've found a weakness. "Earl," he said, "haven't seen you in a while." Earl told him he just needed a hydraulic fitting for the Super M. And Donnie said, "Can I be honest with you?" Earl said he'd prefer it. And Donnie told him that farming 120 acres with a tractor from 1946 and another from 1953 was no way to run an operation. That Tom Bridwell had just bought a 4020, that Jerry Combs had traded up and added 200 acres. That the world was moving forward and Earl was standing still. And then Donnie said those 6 words. "You're too old for this, Earl. Too old for old equipment, too old to do things the hard way, too far behind to ever catch up if you didn't modernize right now." Earl looked at Donnie Granger, looked at his pressed shirt and his college ring and his confident smile, thought about the fact that this man had never once planted a seed in his life. Then Earl asked how much the fitting cost. $375. Donnie said. Earl paid for it, walked out the door, and drove home. Behind him, through the screen door, he heard Donnie say to his parts manager, "That old man is going to farm himself right into the ground." He was wrong, but it would take 18 years to prove it. To understand Earl Hawkins, you have to understand where he came from. He was born in 1918 on a farm outside Smithville, Missouri. His father, Russell Hawkins, had farmed 90 acres through the Great Depression without losing a single acre. Not because of luck, not because of government programs or favorable weather, because Russell Hawkins lived by one rule, and he drove that rule into his son from the time Earl could walk. Never owe more than you can pay off in one bad year. That was it. Russell never borrowed more than one season's income. If a piece of equipment cost more than he could pay back from a single harvest, he didn't buy it. If land cost more than he could cover from 1 year's work, he waited. This made him the slowest growing farmer in Platte County. It also made him the only one who kept his farm through the 1930s, while neighbors lost everything around him. Earl watched that happen as a boy. He carried that rule, like a stone in his pocket, for the rest of his life. When he came home from the Pacific in 1946, Earl bought 120 acres of river bottom ground along the Missouri River for $6,200. He paid it off in 4 years. He bought the Farmall H that same year for $800, cash. He bought the Super M in 1958 for $1,400, cash. In 21 years of farming, Earl Hawkins had never once made a bank payment on anything. And by 1967, the same year, Donnie Granger told him he was too old for this. Earl had $38,000 sitting in savings. His neighbors drove past his place, saw those old red farmalls in the yard, saw the modest house and the worn-out truck, and assumed he was barely getting by. They had absolutely no idea. What happened in the years between 1967 and 1975 is not a Missouri story. It's an American story, and it's one that played out in every farming county in this country. The late 60s and early 70s were boom times in American agriculture. Grain prices were climbing, export markets were opening up. The USDA was telling farmers to plant fence row to fence row. Land values were rising 10 to 15% a year. Every farm magazine, every extension agent, every equipment dealer carried the same message: expand now, borrow to grow, leverage is your friend. And Donnie Granger's dealership was printing money. He sold 19 new tractors in 1968 alone. Every sale came with financing. Every financing deal came with interest. And every farmer who signed a note believed the good times would last forever. Tom Bridwell expanded from 300 acres to 640, financed a new 4020, a combine, and a grain truck. Total debt, $86,000. Jerry Combs went from 200 acres to 520, added a new planter, a new barn. Total debt, $72,000. Dale Fenton bought 400 acres at $380 an acre, financed at 9%, then stacked $40,000 in equipment debt on top. Total exposure, $192,000. Everyone was growing. Everyone was borrowing. Everyone was confident. Earl Hawkins farmed his same 120 acres with his same 2 farmalls, planted corn and soybeans, rotated every year, put money in the bank, drove the same truck, wore the same boots, went to bed early, and got up earlier. Donnie Granger drove past Earl's place every week on his way to customers' farms. Every time he saw those old red tractors in the yard, he shook his head. When someone asked him about Earl at the diner one afternoon, he said Earl Hawkins is a relic. Won't modernize, won't expand, won't listen to reason. I give him 5 more years before he's done. But Earl wasn't watching his neighbors. Earl was doing math. And the math was telling him something that nobody else wanted to see. I want to ask you something before I go on. Have you ever watched everyone around you rush towards something you knew was dangerous and felt completely alone in standing still? Drop a comment and tell me about it. Because what Earl saw coming, almost nobody else believed was possible. And the ones who did believe it were too afraid to say it out loud. By 1975, Earl was 57 years old. His savings had grown to $74,000. His neighbors were leveraged to the ceiling. And Earl did something that September that surprised even the bank. He walked into First National Bank of Platte City and asked to speak with the agricultural loan officer, a man named Charles Denton. Charles had never seen Earl in the loan department. Earl told him he wanted to open a certificate of deposit 12-month term for $60,000 in cash. Charles set down his coffee. He processed the CD. When Earl left, Charles turned to his colleague and said that old farmer just deposited more cash than half our borrowers have in equity. Earl kept $14,000 liquid for operating expenses and emergencies. Went home and kept farming. Kept saving. Kept waiting. He didn't have to wait long. 1,980 arrived. And what happened next echoed across every farming county in America. Interest rates exploded. Grain prices collapsed. Land values crashed. The farmers who had borrowed to expand found themselves drowning in debt they couldn't service on income that had been cut in half. And Platte County was devastated. Tom Bridwell was the first to go. His $86,000 in debt had ballooned to $114,000 after missed payments and penalty interest. His 640 acres were worth less than what he owed. The bank foreclosed in March of 1982. Everything went to auction in April. Tom Bridwell, who had bought that shiny 4,020 inches 1,968 and called Earl old-fashioned for not doing the same, was 51 years old, and he never farmed again. He moved to Kansas City and worked in a warehouse. Jerry Combs held on until 1983, tried refinancing, tried selling equipment, tried cutting every cost he could find. Couldn't make the numbers work. The bank called his loans in August. Auction in September. Jerry was 48. His wife left the following year. He drove a grain truck for a co-op until he retired. Dale Fenton's fall was the hardest. His $192,000 in debt became the largest personal farm bankruptcy in Platte County history. The auction took 2 full days. Dale was 55. He had a heart attack in 1986, survived it, but never fully recovered. And Donnie Granger's dealership, the gleaming expansion he'd mortgaged, the operation he'd built on the back of selling debt disguised as progress, started bleeding in 1981 and never stopped. Every tractor he'd financed was now worth half what was owed. Every farmer he'd convinced to upgrade was either behind on payments or already foreclosed. Granger's John Deere closed in November of 1984. 3rd generation of dealers. Finished. Donnie went on to sell insurance for the next 20 years. Earl Hawkins? Earl's $60,000 CD had matured and been renewed twice. With interest, he now had over $80,000 in the bank. His 120 acres paid off. His tractors paid off. His operating costs minimal. No equipment payments, no land payments, no debt of any kind. When corn dropped to $2 a bushel and soybeans crashed, Earl tightened his belt and kept going. His annual expenses were so low that even the worst years left him in the black. He didn't just survive the farm crisis. He walked straight into it with cash in his hand. The first auction Earl attended was Tom Bridwell's. In April of 1982, he stood in the crowd and watched his neighbor's life get sold off piece by piece. Tractors, combines, trucks, tools, even household goods. Tom stood off to the side with his family, watching strangers pick through 30 years of work. Earl bid on one item. Tom's won. 6-0. Parcel on the east side of the river, the land Tom had bought in 1970 for $320 an acre and financed heavily. The bank's minimum bid was $180 an acre. Earl bid $180. Nobody countered. Sold. $28,800. Cash. After the auction, Earl found Tom. He told him he was sorry. Tom couldn't look at him. Asked if Earl was going to farm the land. Earl said he was. And then he told Tom something. If you ever want to come back to farming, you come see me. I'll put you to work. Fair wage, no charity, just work. Tom shook his head. Said farming had broken him. And Earl said something quiet and true. Farming didn't break you, Tom. Debt broke you. There's a difference. Tom looked at Earl for a long time. Then he said something that stayed with Earl for the rest of his life. You tried to tell me, didn't you? Back in '68 when I bought the 40/20? You said something about your daddy's rule never owe more than one bad year. I laughed at you, called you old-fashioned. Earl nodded. I remember. Turns out, Tom said slowly, old-fashioned is just another word for still standing. Earl went to more auctions. Jerry Combs' sale in 1983. Dale Fenton's in 1984. 3 smaller operations in '85 and '86. Each time, he bought land at crisis prices, paid cash, never borrowed a dollar. By 1985, Earl Hawkins owned 520 acres. He was 67 years old. His total land investment over 4 decades was roughly $96,000. That same land, even at depressed crisis values, was worth over $300,000. But Earl didn't just farm it. He did something that set him apart from every other buyer at every one of those auctions. He gave people a way back. In the spring of 1985, a 24-year-old named Danny Reeves knocked on Earl's door. Danny was Tom Bridwell's nephew. He'd grown up on Tom's farm. He loved farming with everything he had, but he had no land, no equipment, no money, and no credit. Banks wouldn't even look at him. He'd come to ask Earl if he needed any help on the land he'd bought. Earl looked at Danny, saw something he recognized immediately. The hunger, the willingness, the same look Earl himself had carried when he came home from the Pacific in 1946 with nothing but determination. He told Danny he didn't need help, but he'd make him a deal. Earl leased Danny 80 acres of the former Bridwell land. No money down. Rent was 20% of the crop, payable after harvest. If the crop failed, Danny owed nothing. If it succeeded, Danny kept 80%. Earl also lent Danny his 946 Farmall H, 39 years old at the time, slow and loud and everything a modern farmer would laugh at. But it ran, and it was free. "Take care of that tractor," Earl told him. "It's older than you are, and it's earned more respect." Danny farmed those 80 acres for 4 years, paid Earl his 20% every harvest, and saved everything else. In 1989, he had enough to buy 40 acres of his own at auction prices. Earl co-signed the note, the only time in his entire life Earl Hawkins ever put his name on someone else's debt. Danny paid it off in 3 years. Earl did the same thing 6 more times between 1985 and 1995. 6 young farmers who couldn't get financing, couldn't get started, couldn't get anyone to give them a chance. Earl leased them land on generous terms, lent equipment, taught them what his father had taught him, and he gave each one the same rule his own father had given him on a farm outside Smithville, Missouri, back when Earl was too young to understand what it meant. Never owe more than you can pay off in 1 bad year. By 2000, all 6 of those farmers owned their own land. 3 had expanded beyond what they'd ever leased from Earl. Danny Reeves was farming 340 acres, free and clear. Every single one of them credited Earl Hawkins with giving them their start. Donnie Granger heard about it. He'd been selling insurance in Platte City for 16 years by then, living a quiet life, trying not to think too much about the dealership. But Earl's name kept coming up in conversation. At the diner, at church, at the hardware store. Earl helped Danny Reeves. Earl leased land to the Morrison kid. Earl gave the Pratt boy a tractor to use for 2 seasons. And one afternoon in the fall of 2000, Donnie drove out to Earl's farm. He found Earl in the barn, replacing a wheel bearing on the Farmall Super M. The tractor was 47 years old, still running. Earl looked up. Donnie sat down on a hay bale and said what he'd driven all the way out there to say. He told Earl he'd been wrong. Wrong in 1967. Wrong about the tractors. Wrong about modernizing. Wrong about everything. He said he'd been 36 years old and thought he knew everything about farming because he sold tractors. He said he'd sold debt disguised as progress, and most of the farmers who listened to him had lost everything. And the one farmer who'd never listened, the one Donnie had called a relic, was the one who kept his farm and helped a dozen other people keep theirs. Earl set down his wrench. He told Donnie about his father's rule. Never owe more than you can pay off in 1 bad year. "That's all I did," Earl said. "That's the whole thing." Donnie nodded. He stood up, took one last look at the Super M, asked Earl how much he'd paid for it. $1,400, Earl said. In 1958. "And it's still running?" "Still running." Donnie shook his head slowly. He said, "I sold Tom Bridwell a $12,000 tractor that put him out of business. You bought a $1,400 tractor that's still working 42 years later. I think about that more than I should." "Don't be too hard on yourself," Earl said. "You believed what you were taught. We all do." "Yeah," Donnie said. "But what you were taught was right." He drove away. Earl went back to the wheel bearing. In the spring of 2003, the Platte County Equipment Auction held its annual sale. A 240-acre parcel came up the former Fenton place, the farm Dale Fenton had lost in 1984. The land had passed through 2 owners since then, and neither had taken care of it properly. The auctioneer called the final bid, sold to the gentleman in the back row, for $14,000. That gentleman was 85 years old. He paid cash. And that was Earl's 9th farm. He didn't keep it for himself. He leased it to Danny Reeves' son, who was 23 years old and just starting out. Same terms Earl had given Danny 18 years earlier. 20% of the crop after harvest, free use of equipment, and one rule: never owe more than you can pay off in 1 bad year. Earl Hawkins died in 2009 at the age of 91. He had farmed for 63 years. He owned 840 acres, all paid for, all purchased with cash at auctions over 4 decades. He never once bought a new tractor. The 1946 Farmall H ran until 2001, 55 years of service. The 1953 Super M ran until 2007, 54 years. Both of those tractors are in a farm museum in Platte City now, displayed side by side beneath a plaque that reads, "These tractors farmed 840 acres over 6 decades without a single bank payment." At Earl's funeral, Danny Reeves stood up to speak. He said Earl Hawkins gave me 80 acres and a tractor older than I was. He told me to take care of the tractor and never owe more than one bad year's income. I followed that advice for 24 years, and I own 340 acres free and clear today because of it. But Earl didn't just help me. He helped 6 other farmers get started the same way. And those farmers helped others. And those helped others. There are over 30 farms operating in this county today that trace back to Earl Hawkins and an old farmall with a bad wheel bearing. Danny paused. The church was completely silent. Then he said the John Deere dealer told Earl he was too old to farm. Said his equipment was from the Truman administration. Said he was a relic who needed to modernize or quit. 18 years later, the dealer was out of business. Most of his customers had lost their farms, and Earl Hawkins was the only one left standing, with more land than anyone in the county, and a dozen young farmers who called him the reason they got started. I want to leave you with something before you go. Right now, somewhere, someone is being told they're too old, too slow, too small, too set in their ways. Someone is being told they need to borrow more, expand faster, keep up with everyone around them. Someone is being told the way they've always done things isn't good enough anymore. A John Deere dealer told a 49-year-old farmer he was a relic and gave him 5 years before he'd be finished. 18 years later, that farmer owned 520 acres free and clear, and the dealer's business was gone. The farmers Earl helped were building operations of their own, not with borrowed money, not with shiny new equipment, but with a rule that had been passed from a father to a son on a small Missouri farm during the Great Depression. Never owe more than you can pay off in one bad year. That's it. That's the whole secret. Earl said so himself. Everybody wants a complicated answer. The answer isn't complicated. Don't owe what you can't cover. Take care of what you have. Be patient when everyone around you is rushing. And when the crash comes, and the crash always comes, you'll still be standing. Earl Hawkins wasn't the richest farmer in Platte County. He wasn't the biggest. He never made the news, never got written up in a farm magazine, never won an award. He was just the last one standing. And in the end, that turned out to be the only thing that mattered. If this story made you think differently about debt, about patience, about what it really means to build something that lasts, do 3 things right now, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and they deserve to be heard. Drop a comment and tell me the best piece of advice you ever received from someone older than you. I read every single one. And share this with someone who's being told right now that they need to keep up, when what they really need is to hold on. The dealer said he was too old. Earl outlasted them all. And the rule his daddy taught him saved 30 farms. I'll see you in the next one.